Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Otoma Edje. I'm very excited you're able to join us. Some of you may have heard that Mike Burns, who's our guest today, has a new book that's come out called Escaping the Beast. And it's an incredible book from what I've heard so far. I wanted him to share about really why he wrote the book and also provide some additional resources for us. So again, thanks again for joining us, Mr. Burns. The first question I have, as I kind of alluded to, is can you please tell us why you wrote Escaping the Beast and really what it's about?
Sure. Well, I'm grateful to be here again with you, Toma. Thanks for having me. So Escaping the Beast, in some sense, the subtitle of it sort of is on the nose and describes it. So it's the full title of the book is Escaping the Beast: Politics, Allegiance, and Kingdom. And it really is a look at, what is the church to be in the world? What is our role? And I wrote it, I think, for a couple levels. I think one is that our fellowship of churches has not really, to this point, or at least to any degree that I'm aware of, we've not really had a thought through theology or approach to engagement with the world on issues that are divisive or political or, justice issues. How do we interact with politics? Are we political? Are we not? What is our philosophy on that? We just haven't even had the conversation. And so when you don't have the conversation, it leaves you very vulnerable to very divergent points of view. And of course, we're not going to think the exact same on these issues, but when we haven't thought through them at all, I think that often leads too wide of possibilities, and unity becomes very challenging, which leads into one of the other reasons is because we haven't had the conversation, we haven't had a lot of teaching on it. I think a lot of the perspectives that I see in our fellowship are not very biblical in focus. We bring in other viewpoints that we just always had, or that we grew up with, or that were from our culture, our experiences, or that our parents handed down to us, or based on not always complete readings of the Bible or theology. And so, not saying that everyone has to agree again, or even agree with my perspective, but I think just a lot of them are just not thought through at all. And so they're not biblical. And so I think, that was important. And probably the third reason why I wrote it is, I've spent the last 5 years writing, teaching, giving workshops on race and culture primarily. And you cannot dig into those topics without the topic of politics coming up.
Yeah.
If we do question answer, question response at the end, I could bet you $100 that one of the first 2 or 3 questions is always going to be about politics.
I'm sure.
Because, race, culture, and politics are so deeply embedded.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really my motivation. Now, people look and say, wow, obviously, racial justice issues and political issues are at the forefront of our minds right now in the culture. Obviously, that's why you wrote the book, in response to those things. And it really wasn't, to be honest, because I started researching and reading for and outlining and, preparing for this book 2 years ago. And I started writing this book last year, almost a year ago. And so it's just worked out, whether it's spirit ordained or coincidental or however you want to take it, that these things are all now very much at the forefront. So that's why I wrote it. Then to kind of get into the other element of, to circle back to what it's about, I would say, if we look at the broad approaches to how we're going to engage in justice issues and how we're going to engage in political issues, you oftentimes have these two viewpoints that are on opposite ends of the spectrum. And one is what I would call Christian pietism, which is that mindset of we're just here to save souls, help
Hmm.
people get to heaven. We don't need to engage in those, politics and those sorts of issues. Let's
Right.
just be about church, right? And then on the other end, you have kind of full bore social justice warrior. We're here to engage and fix the problems of the world and, the social gospel and all of those things.
Sure.
And I think those are obviously opposite, but they're both in error in different ways. I
Hmm.
think the pietistic approach is problematic because it really, at the end of the day, takes on a keep warm and well fed mentality.
Hmm.
As and that's the way it looks to the world, like, hey, we've got ours, we're just trying to evacuate people out of here. Doesn't matter if the world's going to hell in a handbasket meanwhile. And it starts to look like we don't care. And it really doesn't reflect the values of the kingdom, to just let those things go, or to deal with them on a very cursory level and not really dig in and deal with issues. There's an old illustration that if people are being poisoned by drinking water out of a creek, Christians can run in and help those people who are poisoned. But at a certain point, you might want to go up creek and figure out where the poison's coming from. Like
Right.
what keeps poisoning people? On the other end, then the full engagement, let's get into politics and deal with these things. That can be appealing to some on a certain level, but I think that overlooks the fact that Jesus very intentionally did not go that route. Satan comes to Jesus in the wilderness, and he offers him, and we often don't think about this, but he offers Jesus, you can be emperor of the world. I'll give you all the kingdoms. You'll replace Caesar, you'll replace all of them, you will be king over the whole world. And when we start to think about that, we're like, man, how incredible would that be? Who would be a better emperor of the nations than Jesus? Who would know what to do better than Jesus? And yet we have to be realistic about the fact that Jesus rejected that. And he seemed to know very clearly that what he was doing to establish the kingdom, to go to the cross, to preach the kingdom, to bring that about, was a better solution than him being the emperor and king of the world. So he could have engaged in politics at the ultimate level in a way that we would, we couldn't just say, hey, Otoma, you want to be king of the world tomorrow and make it happen. And even if we did, I'm guessing you would probably feel a little out of your depth of like, man, I don't know that I'm prepared to be the emperor of the whole world and to solve all the world's problems.
Hmm.
Jesus could have in some respects, but he said that's not actually going to fix it. That's not the way. It's the kingdom that will fix it. And so I think when we forget that, we often go that route of politics. We go the route of using the weapons of the world, of trying to gain power, even if it's benevolently. We have this mindset of we want to gain power, pass laws, use politics. And the Bible actually, I think, presents a third way, which is we're not going to sit out of the game and be pietistic, but we're also not going to use the weapons of the world. We're going to engage with the world as a true alternative to the world, as a kingdom that is genuinely in competition for the hearts and souls and minds, and even and offering solutions of how to fix the world's problems. But if we're pietistic, where are we when the problem's there? We have no voice. And
Hmm.
if we're engaged in politics the way the world does, then we look just like the world. So what's the point? What's the point of the kingdom on either one of those extremes? And so in finding our voice as a kingdom, that's what I really try to do in the book is explain what I believe the Bible presents about what is the kingdom, who are we called to be as this prophetic community, this alternative people, and then we go to really specifically what might it look like with that identity in engaging with the world. How can we engage in some of the world's problems? When should we engage? How do we be the kingdom? How will that look differently and be an alternative? And so I try to be as thorough as I can in some of those things without, it being a 1,000-page book or something along those lines. Because I only have a handful of friends that'll read a 1,000-page book. So that's what we're trying to deal with in that book.
And you have a copy of it, I think, right?
I do. Here it is. There you
Oh,
go.
good
Escaping
deal.
the Beast: Politics, Allegiance, and Kingdom.
Okay. Can we see the spine of it? It's a pretty thick book. How many pages is it?
I don't know if I want to tell your audience because it might scare them away.
So it's up
It
there.
is.
It's got some good meat. It's got some
It's
good meat in it.
It's 346 pages.
Okay. Okay. I'm really glad it's coming out right now, actually, because I know you and I talked a little while back, and we kind of said it would have been really nice if it came out like a month or 2 months ago.
Sure.
But I think it actually is coming out at the right time, in my opinion, just because I think people are still up until this point trying to figure out, like, hey, how do I feel about certain things and what should I do? And I think your book is coming out at the right time for a lot of people because they're kind of like, okay, so now what's the next step?
Right.
And I think there's different ways people can go, which is one, to, as you said, to be more like pietistic and like, okay, let's stop this. We want to just be like disciples, and in the sense of just, let's make disciples only. And others may be like, let's have a full-blown social gospel that includes like politics and all these kinds of things. And I think your book comes out at the right time to say all these things are great, but we want to have a biblical focus that really encapsulates everything the way God wants it done. So I think
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I agree. And I think once we really understand what the kingdom is and how it calls us to engage, we start to see that the gospel and what we'll call social justice or justice in the world are not separate issues.
correct.
They're all part of the same thing of God seeking to be king, calling people to a renewed humanity, a renewed world, and us starting to inaugurate and anticipate that time and point to it, almost like, if you go to Costco or Sam's Club and they're not right now because of COVID, but they give out samples. We're offering samples of what justice in God's future world will look like, of what that reality will be. And so you don't really separate the two, and that's the problem with the extreme pietistic or social warrior viewpoints and divergences, is they've separated out the gospel from social justice as though they're two separate things, and they're really not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So the second question I have is, I know there are a lot of books that are out right now, and you look on the New York Times bestseller list, and people are reading White Fragility. They're reading, Ibram, I guess, Kendi's book. I mean, there's so many books that people are reading, and I think it's great to read certain historical books, but I think there's a point too that we can read. There are some books that are coming out that are probably not the best for disciples to read. I know you've written Crossing the Line. You've written All Things to All People, and obviously just coming out right now, Escaping the Beast. And I personally want to recommend everyone read those books as a start. But what would be some other books that you could recommend, either on culture and or politics, to really just help disciples, so they're not just reading like every single book that comes out that may not necessarily be the best book for them?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I do think it's good to read. I think if you're reading secular books, you have to be discerning and be able to eat the meat, leave the bones. And what I encourage people to do is, if you're reading books that are not written from a kingdom perspective, then those can be helpful, especially when they're examining history or
Correct.
looking at some things that have happened. But when they start getting into, more social examination or even solutions, then I find them to be either lacking or oftentimes even misleading or dangerous for a Christian to go into. So I would say a couple. You mentioned Kendi, and I know a lot of people are reading How to Be an Anti-Racist. I actually think his history book, Stamped from the Beginning, is
Yep.
a helpful book. I think the Color of Law by Rothstein is a great book.
Yep.
I
Yep.
think it's
I'm
an
reading that
important
one.
book for people to read.
That's a scary book, man.
Yeah.
Oh man. Ugh.
Yeah. No, it is, and there's, there. I mean, I could go into a bunch of history books. I'll avoid that. I think one that's not particularly American, but I think does kind of cover some important things about race and politics would be The Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. I think that's a helpful book. In the realm of books on race and culture that more come from a biblical worldview, I would recommend Myths America Lives by Richard Hughes. I think that's an excellent book. White Awake by Hill, I think is worth reading. Color of Compromise by Tisby. Divided by Faith. And I got to look down to see the author here because it went right out of my mind. Is it Emerson? Emerson and Smith. And then Trouble I've Seen by Hart is a good one. More recently, just out in the last couple of weeks, is I know you've interviewed recently Swanson with his book, Rediscipling the White Church. I find some value in that book. And then on the more political realm, I would say one book I really enjoy and love is The Patient Ferment of the Early Church by Creeder.
I'm sorry, one more time.
It is The Patient Ferment of the Early Church.
Okay. Oh wow.
It's kind of a mouthful, right? It's not
That's the title.
yeah.
Yeah.
I find that interesting to read. Radical Reconciliation by Bosak and de Young. That's a South African book. That's I appreciate some of the things in there. For the Life of the World by Volf, Volf is the author. Really anything by him. He's got several books I think are very challenging he's really thinking about engaging with the world in justice and political issues. Reading Revelation Responsibly by Gorman is a good one. Awaiting the King by Smith. Just Politics by Sider. And I'll stop the list there. I mean, I don't want to give your listeners 50 books to read, but those are some that I really enjoy. There's another one that I love, Postcards from Babylon by Brian Zond. I enjoy that. That was a challenging book as well. So there's a lot of good ones out there that I haven't named, but those are maybe a start along that line.
Okay. So you have some history books, you have some books on race and culture that you noted, and then some books on politics. So what I'll do is I'll just probably get those titles from you, and then just put them in the show notes for people, so that way they have them and they can kind of at least use them as a jumping off point, if you will.
Sure.
Okay. Now I do have just one last question. I know with everything going on, I was just wondering how things are coming along with the church in Milwaukee.
Minneapolis.
I'm sorry, in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
In Minneapolis, over the last few weeks or months or so, how things are coming along to you guys.
Yeah, God has been really faithful, and I think blessed the church in ways that we that are beyond anything that we've done, which is usually what God does. He'll do things in His timing, and so when you look, if you were to add up all the formulas, I think from a human point of view, you would say the church, the Two Cities Church here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, should maybe not be prospering or doing well. You know, we've gone through a lot. There's a lot of challenges that a lot of other churches are facing, similar ones with COVID, with separation, with not being able to meet together since the beginning of March. There's been racial unrest, you know, which could be potentially divisive in the church. There's been, you know, just a lot of those things. And yet I would say that the church is we're doing okay. We're continuing to, you know, we meet together on Zoom on Sundays. We meet together by small groups throughout the week. Some are starting to meet in person now. We're not meeting in person yet as a whole group. I'm not sure when we're going to do that. I think the guidelines in Minnesota are still maybe a little more restrictive than in other states, and we're definitely trying to respect those. And at least my opinion, Otoma, is I don't know that we're feeling, although some people are really feeling it, would love to be back together, and I think we all would. I don't think we're feeling a panic like, oh my goodness, we better do this or we're falling apart. I think the strength of the small groups is showing through in our relationships. I think the fact that we've, as a church, been dialoguing and learning and exploring and growing in issues of race and culture and our political views for 5 years now, I think has helped us not be so rocked by these things. Not saying that we don't have a lot yet to learn and grow in, we do. But you know, in June, the churches, we've had, I think, about 8 baptisms,
Awesome.
which is you know, pretty amazing. It seems like every time, you know, we go online, there's like, hey, there's a new baptism, and or you know, we hear that, oh, there's another one coming up this week or in a couple days. And so there's literally a good handful of brothers and sisters now that I've never met in person. You know, I don't know them. They started joining us during the COVID time, and they've become disciples, or you know, what have you. And so I'm looking forward to getting together to meet some of our brothers and sisters and see them in person. So God's been really good. We've had you know, obstacles, and we will continue to. But I think, as the Bible says in several places, God uses those obstacles to train us, to make us stronger, to make us more like Christ, and to really bring us together in unity. And I think that's what we're seeing, is with all the challenges of coronavirus and social change and all of those things, we're actually becoming stronger in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of churches are experiencing that now and starting to see what God is doing and can continue to do during these really challenging times.
Mm-hmm. No, that's awesome. I know we had our first service together as a church here in Detroit today in a park. We had probably about 50 people that came together, and it was just good to be able to, you know, be together physically. And I think our restrictions are probably not as tight as they are for you guys, but it was just, you know, hey, I'll take an elbow bump any day. You know, it was
Sure.
good. It was good to see everyone. And you know, I mean, God has also been blessing us with baptisms. And I think the great thing is that despite everything going on, it's good to see that God, we know this, is continuing to work. So, well,
Yeah.
thanks so much for your time. I think those who are continuing to listen to us, I definitely appreciate it. And I do want to encourage you guys to subscribe so we can definitely continue to get the message out to others. I know you also have a podcast. Can you also share briefly about that, and also where people can find the book if they want to purchase it, and just about your ministry in general as we wrap it up?
Yeah. So my podcast is called All Things to All People Podcast with Michael Burns. You can find that on, I think, any podcast platform, Apple, you know, iTunes, Spotify, Pocket Cast, any of those. And we have a good time. I have a lot of guests on there. We talk about issues of culture, race. We'll be getting into politics soon, and from a biblical standpoint and a biblical approach. So been doing the podcast most of this year now, and it's going well. So please look that up and subscribe if you can. And then you can find any of my books or more information from the website michaelburnsteachingministry.com. You can go there and order Escaping the Beast. It's actually out now. Today was supposed to be the release day, and the publisher got it in early, and to their credit, they started sending it out early. So we had kind of a soft release, and today's officially the release day of the book. So you can go, again, that's michaelburnsteachingministry.com. You can go there and find, and we'll keep adding resources there. I don't have a lot of videos and those sorts of things yet, but they will be up there soon, and you'll be able to access those sorts of things through there. So,
okay.
There you go.
Well, again, thanks so much for everything. And like I said, I will put the information in the show notes for everyone to help them as they continue to grow and learn and progress from there. Thanks so much for your time, Mike.
Thanks, Otoma. Appreciate it.